On quiet mornings in the early 1940s, across towns and cities strained by war, ordinary families carried spades and seed packets into shared backyards and vacant lots. The images, preserved in black and white photographs, show small groups bending over soil while factory chimneys marked the horizon. What we know is simple. Food supplies were scarce, rationing shaped daily life, and communities were told that victory could be grown at home. Yet, as with many efforts of the era, what was presented publicly may not reveal the full picture. The gardens appear to have offered real relief, bringing vegetables to tables and giving children a role in their family's survival. They also created a rhythm that encouraged cooperation, and that rhythm may have been quietly documented. Old memoranda and stamped reports, sometimes inconsistent in their dating, suggest that each patch of land was not only a garden, but also a point of observation. A folded paper on a desk, a file stamp that does not align with its contents, and a margin note that changes a reference number all hint that the official story of patriotic gardening could have served multiple purposes. The truth may rest somewhere between the joy of fresh harvests and the calculations of administrators balancing morale with supply. This story, told in shades of gray, is not about exposing secrets, but about exploring how survival, duty, and oversight became entangled in the daily work of families. We begin at the ground level, among the soil and seeds. Chapter 1. Seeds planted. Amid uncertainty, in the early months of the 1940s, when ration books shaped meals and shortages weighed heavily on households, small plots of earth became symbols of endurance. Black and white images from the time show women in plain coats and children in patched clothing kneeling beside narrow garden beds. Their hands worked quickly, turning soil and planting seeds that promised food in the months ahead. The photographs often capture more than faces. A wide shot might include factory chimneys in the distance, a reminder of the war economy that stretched across every community. A close-up might show a tin pail resting beside uneven rows, evidence of improvised tools pressed into service. At first glance, these gardens seem straightforward. They were promoted as patriotic contributions designed to lessen the burden on supply lines and keep families fed. Yet beneath the official narrative, a more layered reading emerges. Some documents that survive from local councils include stamped dates that appear inconsistent with later annotations, suggesting records were adjusted after the fact. A folded memorandum may carry a signature written over an earlier erased mark, raising questions about how records were kept. These small details do not overturn the garden's purpose, but they complicate our view of them. The presence of plain uniforms at the edge of crowd shots, watching rather than digging, hints that community participation was quietly observed. To the families involved, the gardens meant potatoes in the pot and carrots on the table. To officials, they may have offered data points, markers of how people responded to guidance, how quickly they could organize, and how much food production could be shifted outside official channels. In this way, the soil became both nourishment and ledger, each row an entry in a broader calculation. The tone of the surviving images remains calm, even proud. Yet the indicators suggest that while families saw independence, administrators saw evidence to be measured. As the story moves forward, we leave behind the private backyards and step into wider communal spaces, where entire neighborhoods joined in the rhythm of cultivation and where oversight became harder to ignore. Chapter 2. Community Yards. Under watchful eyes, wide shots of shared yards show rows of vegetables and patchwork fences. Neighbors exchange tools and stories in the morning light. Children fetch watering cans while elders inspect seedlings with care. The mood is steady, practical, and quietly cooperative across blocks. Officials praise these yards as practical responses to wartime shortages. Local notices encouraged families to convert lawns and vacant lots. At the same time, peripheral frames show plain uniforms standing at edges. Those figures might indicate oversight alongside voluntary activity in neighborhoods. documents from municipal offices reveal notes left in margins. These margin annotations sometimes change reference numbers in ledgers. Such changes could indicate later adjustments to official records. Photographs alternate between close-up portraits and wide community scenes. A mid-shot often captures a folded memorandum placed on a clerk's desk. The folded memorandum appears in images beside stacks of correspondence. A recurring file stamp marks papers passed through administrative hands. That file stamp sometimes appears dated before the recorded inspection. This inconsistent stamping raises questions about the timing of reports. Families tended plots for supper and for small markets near train platforms. Crates of produce travel from yards toward distribution points in photos. The train platform shots show produce awaiting collection and onward transport. These logistical frames suggest coordination with larger supply channels. Yet gardeners themselves recount the simple need to feed their households. Many accounts emphasize child-sized chores and communal labor on weekends. Clothing in images remains generically described, plain coats and work shirts. Faces are lined but not heroic in staged ways. The photographic tone stays documentary and observational, not sensational. City planners recorded how neighborhoods organized planting rotations and water access. Some municipal memos, however, emphasize measuring participation rates. This focus suggests the yards could have been treated as data points. Administrators might have used participation to predict compliance with directives. The effect on daily life was immediate and practical for many families. Household diets shifted toward vegetables available from garden beds. Recipe notes from the period show simple preparations and shared knowledge. Neighborhood markets adapted, with stalls selling surplus produce to neighbors. The sense of contribution was often framed as civic and moral duty. Public messaging praised the virtue of tending a small plot. That messaging could also have strengthened social pressure to participate. Annotations in official papers sometimes note exceptional participation or absence. Such entries hint at social consequences linked to engagement or withdrawal. Community. Leaders would occasionally receive commendations in circulars. Those commendations may have been used to encourage further involvement. At the same time, sparse records show spot checks by municipal agents. An agent's presence in a photograph is implied by a folded memorandum. These images suggest observational routines alongside communal effort. The combination changed how people perceived voluntary work. For some, gardening felt like private care for kin and neighbors. For others, it seemed a visible act under communal appraisal. Those different views shaped conversations around trust and conformity. The yards also altered household labor patterns and gender roles. Women often led planting and harvesting while men worked industrial shifts. Children contributed with predictable tasks, gaining both responsibility and respite. The daily schedule of many families came to revolve around planting cycles. That rhythm affected meal planning, schooling, and seasonal income. Local charities sometimes coordinated seed and tool distributions. Such coordination may have reinforced organized patterns in neighborhoods. In many towns, municipal buildings displayed notice boards with gardening advice. These public boards conveyed practical tips and reinforced shared expectations. The imagery of notice boards recurs across several archival photos. Together, photos and documents create a layered record of public life. The visual motif of a train platform appears in logistical sequences. A train platform might show crates labeled for community depots. This motif links small plots to wider distribution networks. Officials writing reports tended to quantify yields and participation. Those quantifications may have informed later allocation decisions. Yet the lived experience remained stubbornly local and domestic. Neighbors remembered barter more than central directives in oral records. Memory interviews suggest pride in feeding kin and sharing harvests. At the same time, they note a quiet awareness of being observed. This awareness influenced how families displayed their gardens publicly. Some plots were kept tidy and ornamental for passers-by. Others prioritized productivity and yields over public appearances and tidy presentation. The diversity of approaches shows practical choices shaped by need. Surviving ledgers show entries with changing reference numbers over time. Those ledger changes hint at administrative reclassification or correction. This indicator complicates efforts to read records without caution. The narrative at street level thus balances charity, necessity, and oversight. The yards were spaces of tenderness, calculation, and communal labor. The black and white images capture both labor and quiet constraint. The recurring folded memorandum sometimes appears tucked under correspondence. That folded memorandum signals an administrative thread woven through daily life. As we step back from these community yards, larger institutional frames appear. Markets adjusted to seasonal surpluses, with modest stalls appearing near tram stops. Local bakers and grocers adapted recipes around what gardens could reliably provide. That adaptation eased some pressure on centralized supply chains during lean months. Community disputes occasionally arose over access to shared water and seed stores. Such disputes influenced municipal discussions about equitable resource distribution and oversight. Records show periodic correspondence about fair allocation of seeds and tools. Those letters suggest officials took complaints seriously, sometimes intervening directly. The texture of these archives includes pleas, acknowledgments, and practical directives. Oral histories recall laughter, rivalry, and a relief born from fresh vegetables. Photographs of communal harvests emphasize collective effort and mutual support. Yet the administrative trail persists, with folded memoranda and ledger entries. The presence of a file stamp on correspondence highlights bureaucratic processing. These intersecting traces create a complex portrait of public and private aims. The chapter closes on the scene of a neighborhood market beside a train platform. The next section will move into city offices where policies were debated and recorded. Chapter 3. Institutional files and public messages, quiet office interiors in monochrome, reveal clerks sorting stacks of paper. Each photograph shows rows of wooden desks and neat piles of correspondence. A recurring folded memorandum lies half open on one desk. The folded memorandum appears beside bundles tied with string. Officials in plain uniforms consult these bundles with steady hands. The papers often carry a neat file stamp in the corner. That file stamp sometimes appears dated before the recorded inspection. Such an inconsistent stamped date may suggest later adjustments to official timing. Notices and posters in public squares convey simple messages about thrift and duty. The posters are bold but unadorned, designed to reach broad audiences. They urge families to plant, preserve, and share spare produce. Yet the placement of messages seems to follow municipal routes and market centers. Posters appear on notice boards in municipal halls and on tram shelter panels. Wide exterior shots show these panels near train platforms and busy streets. The train platform scenes connect local harvests to wider distribution networks. Photographs show crates labeled for collection beside platform edges. These logistical frames suggest coordination beyond individual households. In office shots, clerks make entries in ledgers with careful strokes. Sometimes margin annotations change reference numbers in a later hand. Such margin annotation alterations could point to reclassification or retrospective consolidation. Recorded yields are summarized in typed reports sent to central desks. The typed reports often repeat the same slogans found on public posters. This echo raises a question. Did public messaging simply reflect administrative calculation, or did it guide that calculation in turn? The language in official dispatches tends to be plain and managerial. It measures participation, notes exceptional districts, and queries shortfalls. At times, a short note in the margin asks for clarification. That marginal query occasionally receives a later handwritten reply. The staging of documents and the staging of public images seem closely aligned. Photographs of municipal officials greeting harvest delegations are posed but restrained. Officials wear formal coats and nondescript lapels in these group portraits. Close portraits show a uniform lapel or a folded memorandum tucked beneath an arm. The motif of the lapel repeats across multiple frames. This repetition links personal appearance to administrative function. In some files, a stamped directive appears to precede its implementation date. Researchers have found such chronological oddities in several collections. Those dated anomalies might reflect delayed paperwork rather than calculated deception. Still, they complicate how historians read the archive. Public circulars circulated suggestions for seed distribution and composting. These circulars contained practical advice and morale-boosting lines. Local newspapers reprinted guidance alongside human interest columns about family gardens. The mix of practical tips and moral language served multiple audiences simultaneously. Municipal minutes show committees discussing seed allotments and water access. These minutes record debate over priorities and distribution fairness. Some entries emphasize efficiency and measurable yields. Other entries refer to community cohesion and voluntary spirit. The balance between efficiency and morale appears to shift depending on the district. In one exchange, a clerk's note changes. A reference number and request follow-up. That changed reference number indicates administrative reorganization may have occurred. Such reorganization could reflect shifting priorities or simply bureaucratic housekeeping. The public messages, when read together with internal files, form a layered narrative. In some cases, posters seem to prefigure speaking points found in later reports. This alignment may suggest coordinated messaging strategies. It might also indicate a simple recycling of successful language. The visual record includes mid-shots of distribution halls where crates are weighed and tallied. Records from these halls appear in ledgers with neat columns and occasional pencil corrections. Those pencil corrections sometimes match annotations in municipal correspondence. Linking those notes across documents makes the administrative web visible. The web shows how local efforts were folded into broader logistical plans. Families tend to remember the tangible benefits of homegrown vegetables. They recall the taste of fresh beans and the relief of an extra meal. Office records, by contrast, focus on quotas and participation rates. This difference highlights a tension between lived experience and administrative appraisal. A folder stamped for review carries a short cover note asking for estimates. That request for estimates makes clear the reliance on garden outputs in planning. The request also invites skepticism about the completeness of reported numbers. Across regions, variation in harvests forced officials to adjust recommendations. Some municipal offices recommended staggered planting to balance supply. Other offices prioritized quick yields to meet immediate shortages. The resulting mosaic of policies suggests adaptability rather than rigid central command. Yet the consistency of certain phrases and the repetition of themes in posters could indicate centralized templates. A folded memorandum bearing identical phrasing appears in several municipal folders. The repeated phrasing suggests a central template or distributed guidance. Whether that guidance came from local initiative or higher up remains a question. Institutional portraiture often pairs an official handshake with a public garden display. Those images create a narrative of partnership between citizens and administration. At the same time, internal memoranda record questions about compliance and exceptions. One memorandum requests lists of plots that failed to meet expected yields. That request may have been pragmatic, addressing shortages. It could also indicate monitoring of compliance with civic programs. The archive contains correspondences from relief committees and welfare boards. These letters discuss seed loans, tool sharing, and assistance for small households. They also remark on public response to messaging campaigns. Where messages met resistance, officials debated tone and tactics. In some districts, publicity focused on practical demonstrations and seed distribution. In others, messaging emphasized moral duty and civic belonging. The choice of approach influenced public reaction and participation. Oral accounts alongside files reveal how families navigated both guidance and personal need. Many households adopted gardening as a practical survival measure. Others embraced it as a social ritual and a shared responsibility. Those motivations coexisted and sometimes conflicted within the same neighborhood. The film of paperwork and papered notices thus shows human complexity beneath administrative summaries. Folding schedules into municipal calendars, officials attempted to coordinate harvests with market times. The train platform motif returns in logistical photos, linking local depots to regional hubs. Those linkage photos underline how private plots fed into public provisioning. The archive, with its folded memoranda and file stamps, invites careful interpretation. Indicators such as inconsistent stamped dates and margin annotation changes require cautious reading. They do not prove malice or manipulation by themselves. Instead, they show the archive's messiness and the need for nuance. The records capture earnest attempts at planning alongside reactive adjustments. In the end, institutional files and public messages reveal a dialogue between lived practice and recorded policy. This dialogue opens further questions about who decided priorities and how those decisions shaped everyday life. The next chapter will trace how these administrative practices translated into measured outcomes and social consequences. Chapter 4. Records. Suggesting dual functions archival folders, open to reveal a different landscape, one of quiet paperwork and public calculus. A single image can contain many signals. A mid-shot shows a clerk turning pages at a desk. Close-up shows a folded memorandum peeking from under a typed cover note. A wide frame reveals a room of officials in plain coats, moving between file cabinets. The atmosphere is orderly but purposeful. Records from welfare boards and municipal bureaus focus on distribution and assessment. Reports list yields alongside notes about participation. The language is managerial and steady, aimed at planning and allocation. Yet the same pages also register human stories in passing lines. A margin annotation notes anecdotes from a local relief worker. A short typed paragraph acknowledges families who shared seeds with neighbors. These human notes sit beside columns of figures and schedules. In some files, the juxtaposition feels intentional, as if personal acts were being recorded as data. The archival trace suggests a duality. Households are described in terms of need and in terms of measurable civic engagement. In a ledger, a changed reference number appears next to a district summary. That altered number may indicate later recataloguing, or it may signal administrative correction after review. A separate envelope bears a file stamp that overlaps with a later report. The overlapping stamp seems to compress timelines in ways that complicate straightforward reading. Such indicators do not themselves prove intent. They do, however, underline how records were shaped by process, delay, and revision. Officials weighed practical outcomes and public messaging at once. Meeting minutes show debates over whether to emphasize self-sufficiency or communal support. One note suggests shifting emphasis toward measurable outputs. Another minute argues for language that would preserve morale. These discussions suggest policy was negotiated between technical goals and social aims. Where shortages were acute, administrators favored rapid, quantifiable gains. In steadier districts, messaging leaned toward community building. The result was a patchwork of approaches across regions. Files document seed loans and tool inventories. They also record appeals from households seeking assistance. Letters from local committees often include both plea and pride. A short report lists top-performing neighborhoods in neutral tones. Nearby correspondence praises community leaders for organizing shared labor. The pairing suggests rewards for visible civic contribution. At times, records hint at consequences for non-participation. A brief memo requests lists of plots that failed to meet projected yields. The memo might be pragmatic, meant to target assistance. it might also reflect pressure to conform to program expectations. Families recalled in later interviews that social appraisal shaped how they displayed gardens. Some kept plots neat for show. Others buried surplus quietly for family use. The archive captures both behaviors alongside administrative concern. Public images from circulation rounds, posed but restrained, portray officials inspecting neat rows. Close portraits show a uniform lapel or a folded memorandum in hand. Those motifs recur across many frames, linking personal appearance to institutional role. Photographs of crates on a train platform underline distribution logistics. The train platform motif reminds us that these gardens fed more than households. Local markets and depots received produce that moved onward. Administrative planning took that movement into account. Planners compiled timetables and pickup schedules in their ledgers. The same ledgers occasionally show pencil corrections and margin notes. Those pencil marks suggest iterative adjustments to plans. Officials responded to changing harvests and shifting demand. The back and forth in paperwork reflects pragmatic governance rather than a single scripted program. Yet the archival habit of quantifying participation predisposed officials to treat civic acts as metrics. That habit shaped later policy. In one series of files, a repeated phrase appears across multiple circulars. The phrase frames domestic gardening as contribution to national effort. It might have been intended to inspire. It might also have helped standardize reporting. Where phrases recur, they create a template that circulates through departments. The template smooths communication but flattens local variation. Local committees adapted templates to their own contexts. Those adaptations sometimes appear as marginal annotations or altered reference numbers. Such changes illustrate the negotiation between centralized guidance and local practice. The records also show administrative attention to vulnerable households. Case notes record seed loans and deferred repayments. Those entries convey a concern for material welfare. They also map who received help and on what terms. Lists of recipients offer insight into how officials prioritized aid. The inclusion of such lists in broader reports suggests that social support was integrated into logistical planning. The archival voice can therefore sound both measured and humane. Still, when record-keeping becomes a priority, certain behaviors gain visibility while others remain hidden. Oral accounts mention informal exchanges of food and seeds that do not appear in official ledgers. Those absences highlight the limits of administrative sight. Files can show only what officials recorded. Invisible acts of sharing and barter leave limited traces. Researchers must triangulate between paperwork, photographs, and memory to see the fuller picture. Institutional files make visible the calculation of public life. They reveal priorities, hesitations, and adjustments. They also reveal how civic duties may have been encouraged through public recognition. Commendations and circulars shaped local reputations. In communities where public praise followed visible participation, social pressure reinforced administrative aims. Conversely, in areas where records emphasized need over performance, policy lent more heavily on relief. The archive therefore encodes different modes of governance. Some records suggest a managerial posture focused on outputs. Others reveal an emphasis on communal bonds and morale. The coexistence of these approaches complicates straightforward interpretation. The motif of the folded memorandum and the file stamp recurs in both strands. Those motifs remind us that the everyday work of households and the paperwork of administration were part of the same ecosystem. Policy decisions affected household routines. Household routines fed back into policy through reports and requests. The dynamic created feedback loops between private action and public response. One folder records a corrective directive after a round of distribution. That directive adjusts seed allocations based on reported yields. It indicates responsiveness. In planning, it also shows how garden outputs influenced official estimates. The interplay of data and daily life shaped subsequent recommendations and resource flows. The records thus trace a cycle of need, response, and revision. That cycle had human consequences. Families altered chores and diets in response to availability. Neighborhood labor patterns adapted around planting and harvest schedules. Children took on tasks that freed adults for other work. The social fabric shifted in ways that outlasted the immediate crisis. Yet the archival evidence also suggests a persistent tension. Measuring civic contribution can elide private hardship. Recording participation as a metric can shape how help was distributed. This tension raises questions about the ethics of administrative visibility. How should officials balance measurement with compassion? The documents rarely answer directly. They offer instead a mosaic of attempts, compromises, and occasional inconsistencies. These traces invite careful reading and ongoing inquiry. The next chapter will follow how those administrative traces translated into longer-term echoes in policy and public memory. Chapter 5. Echoes carried into later policies. In the years after conflict, allotments and small plots remained part of urban life and municipal thinking. City streets returned to peacetime routines, while gardens kept producing for tables and markets. Planners and officials began to fold wartime lessons into longer-term policy frameworks. A file stamp on several municipal folders marks this shift in administrative attention. Policy papers examined how domestic production might reduce future supply shocks. Those papers often mirror wartime circulars in tone and phrasing. The repetition suggests institutional learning rather than spontaneous revival. At local meetings, officials cited garden yields as evidence for expanded programs. Community advocates argued for permanent allotments and garden support. Their proposals framed gardening as both welfare and civic education. School programs adapted agricultural themes into curricula and after-school clubs. Such programs taught basic plant care and communal responsibility. Urban redevelopment plans sometimes preserved space for communal plots amid new housing. The train platform motif reappears in later photos, showing crates destined for municipal canteens. That logistical image ties domestic cultivation to public provisioning across time. Records from redevelopment offices show lists of proposed garden sites and projected yields. A folded memorandum appears in several of those files, connecting wartime folders to later initiatives. Marginal annotations. They sometimes clarify intended beneficiaries. Occasionally, a changed reference number appears in successive files. That altered number may indicate reclassification or administrative consolidation. Such changes complicate simple readings of policy continuity. They also suggest iterative policy design, not a single, seamless program. Administrators often borrowed language from earlier templates when drafting new guidance. The use of familiar phrasing created a sense of continuity in municipal practice. Yet the reuse of language could mask important shifts in emphasis. Wartime urgency focused on immediate yields. Post-war policy placed greater weight on education and social stability. This shift altered how gardens were framed in public programs. Where earlier circulars emphasized contribution to national effort, later memos stressed community health and local economy. The motif of the uniform lapel remains in official portraits, but the lapel increasingly represents civic administration. Rather than wartime authority, community leaders received formal recognition in municipal bulletins. Those recognitions often drew from lists and reports compiled during wartime. The persistence of such lists shows how administrative memory shapes public acknowledgement. At the same time, oral recollections emphasize the private, domestic meaning of gardens. Families remembered saving for winter and swapping seeds with neighbors. Those memories rarely appear in formal ledgers. The archive, therefore, privileges certain traces over others. Where paperwork records measurable outputs, social exchanges often leave only fleeting evidence. Researchers must thus read across sources to reconstruct fuller practices. Public fairs and harvest festivals became sites where institutional memory met community ritual. Photographs of these events show neat rows of produce, smiling faces, and papers tucked into folders for official record. A file stamp on event paperwork links celebratory scenes to municipal processing. The physical act of stamping implies both recognition and bureaucratic capture. Recognition made some activities visible to authorities. Bureaucratic capture transformed lived acts into data points. That transformation had human consequences. Families found new opportunities to access small loans and shared tools. At the same time, conditional assistance sometimes required visible participation. The need to appear engaged shaped how households presented their plots. Some invested in tidiness and order to satisfy public expectations. Others prioritized hidden storage of surplus to protect family reserves. These behavioral adaptations followed from how programs were administered. When support hinged on documented participation, private needs sometimes took a back seat to administrative visibility. Debates within councils reveal concern about fairness in allocation. Minutes show arguments about whether to base assistance on recorded yields or on demonstrated need. Those debates often pivoted on practicality and ethical considerations. The recurring folded memorandum in council files shows points of contention and compromise. Occasionally, correspondence carries inconsistent stamped dates across related documents. That inconsistency may reflect delayed processing or the retroactive filing of reports. It also raises questions about the sequence of decision-making and its public presentation. Where timelines are compressed on paper, the causal story becomes harder to verify. Policy scholars therefore treat dated anomalies as indicators requiring careful contextualization. The post-war period also saw a shift toward formalized volunteering programs. Local committees organized seed banks and tool libraries. These institutions institutionalized the neighborly exchanges that had flourished informally. In some districts, the tool libraries later became community centers. They hosted classes on soil management and food preservation. Such civic investments reframed gardening as an educational resource and a public good. Municipal budgets began to allocate modest sums for community gardens. Budget lines appear alongside other small recurring expenditures. That fiscal inclusion normalized the presence of gardens within public planning. At the same time, the presence of official budgets created expectations. Local administrators were accountable for measured outcomes and public reports. The pressure to document results sometimes favored quantifiable activities over qualitative community benefits. Records therefore emphasize yields, participation, rates, and distribution logistics. The train platform images in logistics reports show crates with simple labels. Those labels connect small garden outputs to wider distribution systems. They also reveal how municipal planners valued traceable supply chains. In contrast, many household practices remained unrecorded. Informal barter, private sharing, and unmeasured aid leave little archival residue. Oral histories fill some gaps, but are fragmentary and selective. The resulting archive is therefore partial and uneven. Across decades, policymakers referenced wartime experiments as both precedent and cautionary tale. Some committees highlighted the garden's ability to foster resilience. Others warned about unintended social pressure and the ethical costs of measurement. That tension shaped later design choices and program rhetoric. Modern urban planners sometimes cite historical garden programs when arguing for green space. They stress social cohesion, food security, and mental health. Yet archival traces remind them that administrative visibility brought trade-offs. The motif of the file stamp and folded memorandum persists in policy archives as a reminder of past practices. Those motifs bind together episodes of crisis, recovery, and institutional memory. They also invite reflection on how states learn from citizen action. The story therefore ends not with closure, but with questions about legacy. How should societies balance the benefits of organized civic effort with the privacy of household? Survival? How do records and recognition shape behavior over time? These questions push forward toward contemporary debates about urban food systems and civic responsibility. and they set the stage for closing reflections that re-examine memory and policy in light of everyday lives. In later years, the gardens remained visible in city photographs and municipal files. The images stay in black and white, linked by recurring visual motifs. A folded memorandum appears across decades, tucked into different folders and files. A file stamp resurfaces on event notices and post-war program proposals. These motifs suggest administrative memory threaded through everyday survival and civic action. Families who once planted for immediate need kept gardening habits into calmer times. School clubs taught plant care as part of regular activities. Local budgets began listing modest funds for communal plots. At the same time, records sometimes show compressed timelines on paper. An inconsistent stamped date appears on a set of related reports. Margin annotations also conflict with later summaries in a few files. Those indicators complicate the neat story of steady institutional learning. Public praise for visible participation coexisted with private acts of sharing and barter. Oral memories emphasize taste, thrift, and neighborhood solidarity rather than official accounting. Administrators focused on yields, participation, and measurable outputs. That focus may have encouraged tidy presentations and visible compliance. It might also have left less visible needs unrecorded and unsupported. The train platform motif recurs in logistics images, linking home plots to municipal depots. The uniform lapel and folded memorandum motifs tie personal work to administrative frames. These visual echoes indicate mutual shaping of policy and practice over time. The past, therefore, offers both precedent and warning. How should officials today balance measurable benefits with unseen household needs? How can planners honor informal, unrecorded exchanges while designing equitable programs? Questions about visibility, measurement, and memory remain open. The archive invites further inquiry rather than definite answers, and the next moment in this story asks us to look again at ordinary lives and institutional choices.